The alien child's scream pierced the diplomatic chamber as security alarms shrieked through the Confederation embassy. Queen Elena Vasquez didn't flinch as a royal guard moved into protective formation around her, their movements precise and silent despite the chaos erupting beyond the reinforced walls. Ambassador Kethvar's forearms trembled as he clutched his daughter Zira to his chest, the young Vel'thari's bioluminescent scales flickering in patterns Elena had learned meant terror. "They're coming for her," the ambassador whispered, his translator converting the clicking sounds into urgent English. "The Purists found us." Elena stepped forward despite Captain Morrison's restraining hand on her shoulder. 3 years of ruling Earth's first interstellar government had taught her, when protocol mattered and when it didn't, this was the latter. "How long do we have?" "Minutes, maybe less." Kethvar's secondary arms wrapped protectively around his daughter while his primary hands worked frantically over a portable communicator. "The Vel'thari Purification Council has declared her contaminated. They say her mother's choice makes her an abomination." The words hit Elena like ice water. She knew about the Purists, xenophobic extremists who believed interspecies relationships polluted their genetic lines. What she hadn't known was that Kethvar's late wife had chosen a human partner before their arranged marriage, that this child carried human genetic markers. Zira's wide, opalescent eyes found Elena's face. Despite her fear, the girl's scales shifted to soft gold patterns Elena recognized as curiosity. "Are you really the human queen?" she asked in perfectly accented English. "I am." Elena knelt despite Morrison's disapproving grunt, bringing herself to the child's eye level. "And you're safe here. My mother told me about humans before she died," Zira continued, her voice steady despite the approaching sounds of combat in the corridors outside. "She said humans don't abandon their friends." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Elena felt the weight of every eye in the room, her security detail, the diplomatic staff, the terrified ambassador. Outside, the sounds of energy weapons grew closer. "Captain Morrison?" Elena said quietly, never breaking eye contact with the child. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Signal Fleet Command. I want the Sovereign Shield moved into orbital defense position around this station." Morrison's training warred with his concern. "Ma'am, that's an act of war if they fire on Confederation forces. Only if we fire first." Elena stood slowly, her formal robes rustling in the sudden silence. "The Vel'thari Purists are not the Confederation. They're terrorists operating outside legitimate authority." Kethvar's scales brightened with hope, but before he could speak, the chamber's main door exploded inward. Vel'thari warriors in ceremonial armor poured through the breach, their weapons trained on the small group. The lead warrior, his scales bearing the silver markings of a purification enforcer, spoke in the harsh, clicking language of his people. Elena's translator rendered his words with mechanical coldness. "Surrender the contaminated offspring. Your involvement ends here, human queen." Elena stepped between the warriors and the child, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "Zira is under the protection of the Human Federation. You have no authority here." "We have the authority of genetic purity," the enforcer replied, his weapon shifting toward Elena. "The child carries human corruption. She cannot be allowed to live." "Her mother chose love over your laws," Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "That makes her stronger, not weaker." The enforcer's scales darkened to deep purple. Rage, Elena knew. "You understand nothing of our ways. I understand enough." Elena's hand moved slowly to her ceremonial sash, where she wore not just symbols of Earth's authority, but of the growing interspecies alliance she'd helped forge. "I understand that your Confederation allies disagree with your methods. I understand that holding a child responsible for her parents' choices is the act of cowards." Zira stepped out from behind her father, her small hand finding Elena's. The gesture was simple, trusting, and it changed everything. "She chose me," the child whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "The human queen chose me, just like my mother chose love." The enforcer raised his weapon, but Morrison was faster. The Royal Guard's stunner took down 2 warriors before they could react, and the chamber erupted into controlled chaos. Elena swept Zira behind the diplomatic podium as energy bolts scorched the air where they'd been standing. Through her neural implant, Elena felt the Sovereign shield move into position above them. Admiral Peterson's voice reached her through the combat. "Fleet stands ready, Your Majesty. Your orders?" Elena looked down at Zira, whose scales now pulsed with determined silver, the same color as her mother's wedding band, which she wore on a chain around her neck. "Protect what matters," Elena whispered back, and opened a channel that would broadcast to every ship, every station. The real battle was just beginning. The broadcast crackled to life across human space as Elena's voice carried through the neural networks connecting Earth's colonies. "Citizens of the Human Federation, I stand in defense of a child whose only crime is existing. The Vel'thari Purists believe genetic purity matters more than love, more than choice, more than life itself." Around her, the firefight continued with deadly precision. Morrison's team had established a defensive perimeter, their training evident in every movement. But the Purification Enforcers weren't ordinary soldiers. They were fanatics, and fanatics fought differently. "They're bringing up heavy weapons," Morrison reported through their tactical channel. "These walls won't hold much longer." Elena kept Zira close, feeling the child's scales pulse with rapid patterns she couldn't identify. Fear, probably, though the girl remained remarkably calm. "What's your mother's name?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice steady as energy bolts scorched the air above their heads. "Lysa Andri." Zira's pronunciation was careful, reverent. "She was beautiful. Father says she had the most complex scale patterns anyone had ever seen." Complex how? She could show happiness and sadness at the same time. The elders said it was a genetic anomaly, but Mother said it was because she loved two worlds. Zira's scales shifted to a pattern Elena had never seen before, gold threaded through with deep blue, creating something that looked like starlight on water. The realization hit Elena like a physical blow. "You can do it too? The dual pattern expression?" "Yes. Father says it proves the human genetic integration worked." Zira's voice carried pride now, not shame. "The Purists say it proves I'm contaminated." Another explosion rocked the chamber, closer this time. Elena's neural implant buzzed with incoming communications from across human space. Colony governors, fleet commanders, civilian leaders, all demanding to know if humanity was going to war over one alien child. The answer should have been obvious. One child wasn't worth risking millions of lives. But as Elena watched Zira's scales shift through patterns that told stories of love transcending species barriers, she realized this wasn't about one child. This was about what humanity chose to stand for. "Admiral Peterson," she transmitted, "standing by, Your Majesty. The Sovereign's shield is authorized to defend this station against hostile forces. However, I want minimal casualties. These are still Confederation citizens, even if they're acting independently." "Understood. Deploying defensive screens now." Through the chamber's reinforced windows, Elena saw streams of energy lance down from orbit, creating a shimmering barrier around the embassy. The Purification Enforcers' heavy weapons struck the shields and dissipated harmlessly. The lead Enforcers' scales turned almost black with rage. "You cannot protect the abomination forever, Human Queen. Our fleets are already moving." "Your fleets?" Ambassador Kefvar finally found his voice, rising shakily from behind their makeshift barricade. "You've committed treason against the Confederation Council. The Council has grown weak, corrupted by alien influence, starting with you, traitor." Elena moved without thinking, throwing herself between the weapon and Kefvar. The energy bolt meant for the ambassador struck her instead, sending her crashing to the floor as pain exploded through her left side. Zira's scream pierced the air, not fear this time, but pure fury. The child's scales erupted in patterns Elena had never imagined possible, colors shifting so rapidly they seemed to blur into something almost too bright to look at. And then the impossible happened. Morrison's team, hardened soldiers who'd faced death across a dozen worlds, stopped fighting. The Purification Enforcers, fanatics who dedicated their lives to genetic purity, lowered their weapons. Even the combat drones hovering outside the windows went still. Everyone in the chamber was staring at Zira, whose scales now displayed something that transcended normal Vel'thari communication. It was emotion made visible, love given form, the bridge between two species rendered in living light. "This is what my mother saw," Zira whispered, her voice carrying despite its softness. "This is what she chose when she loved a human. Not contamination. Not weakness. Beauty." Elena struggled to her feet, ignoring the burning pain in her side. The energy bolt had cauterized the wound, leaving her mobile but definitely not at full strength. "Do you see it now?" she asked the enforcer, whose weapon hung forgotten in his hands. The purification enforcer's scales flickered uncertainly between rage and something else. Wonder, perhaps, or fear of his own reaction. "It's impossible. It's evolution," Elena said simply. "It's what happens when love refuses to acknowledge boundaries." Her neural implant chimed with an urgent message from Admiral Peterson. "Your Majesty, we have Vel'thari ships dropping out of hyperspace. Lot of them. This is about to get very complicated." Elena looked at Zira, whose impossible scale patterns continued to shift through expressions that somehow conveyed both Vel'thari tradition and human innovation. The child was living proof that some things mattered more than genetic purity. Some things were worth going to war over. The Vel'thari fleet materialized like angry stars against the black of space, their bioluminescent hulls pulsing with coordinated patterns that Elena's tactical implant identified as combat formations. Admiral Peterson's voice crackled through her neural link. 43 vessels, Your Majesty. Mix of Purification Council ships and regular Confederation forces. They're demanding we surrender the child." Elena pressed her hand against the cauterized wound on her side, feeling the heat still radiating from the energy burn. Around her, the standoff in the diplomatic chamber had shifted into something stranger. The purification enforcers stood frozen, their weapons lowered, all staring at Zira, whose impossible scale patterns continued to flow like liquid starlight. "Response from the Confederation Council?" Elena asked through her implant. "That's the problem, ma'am. The Council's split. Half are backing the Purists. Half are calling this an illegal military action. We're in the middle of a civil war that just went hot." Captain Morrison approached Elena carefully, his weapon still trained on the entranced purification enforcers. "Your Majesty, with respect, we need to evacuate. That wound needs medical attention, and this situation is way above our pay grade. No evacuation." Elena's voice carried the absolute authority of 3 years ruling humanity's first interstellar government. "The moment we run, we lose any moral authority to protect anyone. Zira stays here, under Federation protection." Ambassador Kethvar clutched his daughter closer, his forearms trembling with exhaustion and fear. "Your Majesty, you don't understand the forces at play here. The Purification Council has spent decades building support for their ideology. This child represents everything they fear most." "Good." The word came out harder than Elena intended. Fear means they realize their time is ending. Zira looked up at Elena, her scales now settled into a stable pattern that seemed to incorporate elements from both Vel'thari and human emotional expressions. "Will you really fight a war for me?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Elena felt the weight of it, the responsibility of speaking for an entire species. Through her neural implant, she could sense the tension across human space. Colonies preparing for possible attack, fleets moving into defensive positions, millions of people waiting for their queen's answer. "I'm not fighting for you," Elena said quietly. "I'm fighting for what you represent. The right to choose love over hate, progress over stagnation, hope over fear." The lead purification enforcer shuddered suddenly, as if waking from a dream. His scales flickered rapidly between confusion and rage before settling on the deep purple of fury. "Enough! The contaminated one dies, and any who stand with her." He raised his weapon toward Zira, but before he could fire, something extraordinary happened. The other purification enforcers, his own soldiers, turned their weapons on him. "Stand down, Enforcer Prime," one of them said, her voice shaking. "I've seen what the child can do. This isn't contamination." "Traitors!" The Enforcer Prime's scales went fully black. "You've all been corrupted by human weakness." "No," the female enforcer replied, her weapon steady despite her trembling voice. "We've seen what strength actually looks like." Elena's tactical display lit up with new information. The Vel'thari fleet above them was fragmenting, ships peeling away from the main formation as crews apparently chose sides in real time. Some accelerated toward the station with obvious hostile intent, while others moved to defensive positions that suggested they weren't planning to attack. Admiral Peterson, status report. It's chaos up here, Your Majesty. Near as we can tell, about half the Vel'thari crews are refusing to fire on the station. The other half are either fanatically loyal to the Purification Council, or scared enough of being labeled traitors that they'll follow orders. Elena looked at Zira, whose scale patterns had stabilized into something that looked almost human in its emotional clarity. The child had somehow triggered a schism in the Vel'thari forces simply by existing, by demonstrating that genetic mixing didn't create weakness, but rather something entirely new and powerful. Can our shields hold against the hostile ships? For a while, but not indefinitely. And ma'am, there's something else. Long-range sensors are picking up human fleet elements jumping in system. Looks like several colony governors decided not to wait for official orders. Elena's heart skipped. Rogue fleet actions could turn this diplomatic incident into an interstellar war that would consume both species. Which colonies? New Geneva, Kepler Station, and the Titan shipyards. That's at least 30 vessels jumping in without authorization. The weight of command settled on Elena's shoulders like lead armor. In the next few minutes, her decisions would determine whether two species found a path toward greater understanding or descended into a war that would span light years and consume millions of lives. Through it all, Zira watched her with those impossible eyes, scales shifting in patterns that somehow conveyed both absolute trust and terrible understanding of the stakes. Elena opened a broadcast channel that would reach every ship, every station, every world within 50 light years. All forces, human and Vel'thari. This is Queen Elena Vasquez. Stand down and prepare to receive new orders. The universe held its breath. Elena's words echoed across the void as ships from two species hung motionless in space, weapons trained on each other in a tableau that would determine the future of interstellar relations. Through her neural implant, she felt the weight of millions, waiting for her next words. I stand here wounded by those who claim genetic purity matters more than a child's life, she continued, her voice carrying both pain and conviction. But I also stand here protected by those same people's soldiers who chose conscience over blind obedience when they saw something that challenged their assumptions. In the diplomatic chamber, the Vel'thari enforcers who had turned against their commander stood in an uncertain cluster, their scales flickering between shame and determination. Zira moved among them like a small beacon, her impossible patterns somehow offering comfort to warriors who had spent their lives believing she was an abomination. Ambassador Kethver spoke in his native tongue. The clicking sounds translated for Elena. She's telling them about her mother, about the choice that created her. The Enforcer Prime, now isolated and surrounded by his own former troops, raised his weapon towards Zira one more time. I will not allow this contamination to spread. Captain Morrison moved faster than Elena had ever seen him move, his stunner dropping the fanatic before he could fire. The Enforcer collapsed, his scales fading to the gray of unconsciousness. Your Majesty, Admiral Peterson's voice crackled through the neural link. The Vel'thari council ships are requesting permission to board the station. They want to see the child for themselves. Elena felt ice form in her veins. Which council members? Elder Thrixandal is leading them. Ma'am, that's the head of their science cast. If anyone can verify the child's true nature, it's him. The name carried weight. Thrixandal was ancient even by Vel'thari standards, respected across their entire civilization for his knowledge of genetics and evolutionary biology. His word could end this crisis, or make it infinitely worse. Grant permission for Elder Thrixandal only. No armed escorts. Ma'am, with respect, that's Admiral. The moment we treat this as a military confrontation instead of a question of science and ethics, we lose the moral authority we need to protect Zira. Elena touched the cauterized wound on her side. Some risks are worth taking. Zira looked up at Elena, her scales now showing a pattern Elena was beginning to recognize as hope mixed with fear. He knew my mother, before she chose love over law. 20 minutes later, Elder Thrixandal entered the chamber with movements that spoke of vast age and careful consideration. His scales bore intricate patterns Elena had learned indicated high rank and deep learning, but there was something else, a sadness that seemed carved into his very posture. He approached Zira slowly, his large eyes studying the child's impossible scale patterns with scientific fascination and personal pain. Lysandre, he whispered in his native tongue, and Elena's translator rendered it as a name spoken with immense reverence. I see her in you, child, but I see something else as well. Zira stepped forward without fear, her scales shifting to display patterns that somehow conveyed both respect for the elder and confidence in her own nature. Do you see contamination, elder? Thrixandel was quiet for long moments, his ancient eyes studying every nuance of the child's expressions. Around him, the chamber had gone completely silent. Even the tactical displays seemed muted, as if the universe itself was waiting for his verdict. I see evolution, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute scientific authority. I see what our people could become if we chose growth over stagnation. The words hit the chamber like a shockwave. Through her neural implant, Elena felt the ripple effect spreading across both fleets as the Elder's pronouncement was transmitted to every ship. The Purification Council teaches that genetic mixing weakens us, Thrixandel continued, his gaze never leaving Zira. But this child proves the opposite. She has capabilities neither parent species possesses alone. She can express emotions we thought impossible, process thoughts in ways that transcend our individual limitations. Elder, one of the reformed enforcers spoke hesitantly. Does this mean the Council's teachings are wrong? The Council's teachings are fear-dressed as wisdom, Thrixandel replied, his scales flickering with patterns Elena recognized as deep conviction. This child and others like her represent our future, not our contamination. Elena felt something shift in the chamber's atmosphere. The tension that had held everyone frozen began to transform into something else. Hope, perhaps, or the first stirrings of real change. But through her neural implant, Admiral Peterson's voice brought harsh reality crashing back. Your Majesty, we have a problem. The hardcore purification ships are refusing to acknowledge Elder Thrixandel's authority. They're accelerating toward the station, weapons hot. Elena looked at Zira, whose scales now pulsed with patterns that somehow conveyed both tremendous power and terrible vulnerability. The real test was about to begin. The purification fleet descended on the station like falling stars, their bioluminescent hulls pulsing with the synchronized patterns of coordinated attack. Elena felt the station shudder as the first energy volley struck Admiral Peterson's defensive screens, the barriers flaring brilliant white against the darkness of space. Shields holding at 87%, Peterson reported through the Neuralink. But Your Majesty, they're not trying to destroy the station. They're trying to overload our defenses so they can board. Elena understood the strategy. The fanatics wanted Zira alive long enough to make her death a public spectacle, a warning to any who would dare mix Vel'thari genetics with alien DNA. The thought filled her with cold fury. Status of the reformed Vel'thari ships? Moving to intercept their former allies. Elder Thrixandel's ship is broadcasting surrender demands, but the purification vessels aren't responding. In the chamber, Zira pressed close to Elena's side, her impossible scale patterns now flickering rapidly between configurations Elena couldn't identify. They're so angry, the child whispered. I can feel it from here. Feel what? Elena asked, kneeling despite the pain from her wound. The fear underneath their anger. They know I'm right and they're terrified of what that means. Zira's scales settled into a pattern that looked like starlight reflected on deep water. My mother told me that fear makes people do terrible things. Elder Thrixandel approached them, his ancient face grave with understanding. The Purification Council has built their entire identity on genetic superiority. Your existence proves their foundational beliefs are not just wrong but actively harmful. They cannot allow you to live without admitting they have spent centuries perpetuating a lie. Another shudder ran through the station as the purification ships intensified their attack. Through the reinforced windows, Elena could see energy bolts streaking past like deadly lightning, most absorbed by Peterson's shields but some beginning to penetrate through sheer volume. Your Majesty, Captain Morrison approached with his usual controlled urgency. We're receiving boarding signals. They're going to try to break through in the next few minutes. Elena stood slowly, her mind racing through tactical possibilities. The human fleet elements were still too far out to provide effective support. The reformed Vel'thari ships were outnumbered and outgunned by the fanatics. In a straight fight, the station's defenses would eventually fail. But this wasn't a straight fight. Admiral Peterson, I need you to do something that's going to sound insane. I'm listening, Your Majesty. Drop the defensive screens. Silence echoed through the Neuralink before Peterson's voice returned, carefully controlled. Ma'am, that would expose the station to direct fire. We'd have maybe 30 seconds before they realize we've surrendered and move in to board. Yes. Elena looked at Zira, whose scales had shifted to patterns that looked almost like human expressions of determination. I need you to trust me, Admiral. Your Majesty, with all due respect, this is an order. Elena's voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had made the hard choices for 3 years and learned to live with the consequences. Drop the screens and signal surrender. All human vessels are to power down weapons and assume defensive positions only. Through the windows, Elena watched the energy barriers flicker and die. The purification ships immediately ceased firing, their formations shifting to boarding configuration as they moved toward the station's docking bays. They're coming, Ambassador Kethvar whispered, all 4 of his arms trembling. Yes, they are. Elena placed a protective hand on Zira's shoulder. And they're going to see exactly what they're trying to destroy. The first purification soldiers entered the diplomatic chamber 15 minutes later, their ceremonial armor gleaming with the harsh beauty of absolute conviction. Their leader, a scarred veteran whose scales bore the deep purple of religious fervor, surveyed the scene with obvious satisfaction. The human queen surrenders, he announced in accented standard. The contaminated offspring will be purified according to council law. I haven't surrendered, Elena replied calmly. I've simply stopped hiding behind weapons and asked you to face the truth. The veteran's scales darkened with confusion. What truth? Instead of answering, Elena stepped aside, allowing the soldiers to see Zira clearly for the first time. The child stood without fear, her impossible scale patterns flowing through configurations that told stories of love transcending species barriers, of strength found in diversity, of beauty born from the meeting of 2 worlds. The effect was immediate and devastating. 3 of the boarding soldiers stumbled backward as if struck. 2 others lowered their weapons involuntarily. The scarred leader stared at the child with an expression Elena couldn't read. Impossible, he whispered. No, Elena said quietly. Inevitable. This is what happens when love refuses to acknowledge the boundaries you've built out of fear. Zira stepped forward, her scales now displaying patterns that somehow conveyed both vulnerability and immense strength. I am not contaminated, she said in the clear voice of a child who had learned to speak truth in the face of hatred. I am what my mother chose. I am what love creates when it's allowed to grow. The scarred leader raised his weapon toward the child, but his hands were shaking. Around him, his soldiers stood frozen, their convictions crumbling in the face of something they had been taught was impossible but could no longer deny. Through her neural implant, Elena felt Admiral Peterson's urgent transmission. Your Majesty, the human fleet is in position. Orders? Elena looked at Zira, whose impossible existence had just shattered the certainties of the most fanatical purification soldiers. The child stood like a living bridge between 2 species, proof that some things were more powerful than hate. Stand ready, Admiral, Elena replied, but let them choose. The moment of decision had arrived. The scarred purification leader stood frozen for heartbeats that stretched like hours, his weapon trained on Zira while his entire worldview cracked apart around him. Elena watched the war playing out across his scaled features, decades of indoctrination battling against the evidence of his own eyes. Around him, his soldiers were experiencing their own crisis of faith. Some maintained their aggressive postures, scales dark with the fervor of true believers. Others had lowered their weapons, staring at Zira with expressions of wonder and growing horror at what they'd come to do. "Eh!" "She's beautiful," one of them whispered in their native tongue, the words translated into Elena's neural implant as reverent awe. "She's an abomination," the scarred leader snarled, but his weapon hand trembled with uncertainty. Elder Thrixandal stepped forward slowly, his ancient authority radiating calm in the chaos of colliding beliefs. "Commander Prexthal," he said, addressing the scarred leader by name. "You knew Lysa Andre before her choice. Tell me what you see in her daughter." The commander's scales flickered between purple rage and something else. Pain, perhaps, or the memory of loss. "I see the woman who could have been my mate," he said finally. "The woman who chose alien corruption over the purity of our bloodlines." Elena felt the pieces click into place. This wasn't just about ideology. It was personal. The scarred commander had been rejected for a human lover. His hurt and humiliation transformed into religious fanaticism. "You loved her," Elena said quietly, and watched the commander's scales flush with shame. "Love is weakness," he replied, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Zira stepped forward without fear, her impossible scale pattern shifting to display something that looked like compassion rendered in living light. "My mother spoke of you," she said, her young voice clear in the silence. "She said you were kind once, before the Purification Council taught you to hate what you couldn't control." The commander's weapon hand shook violently. "She chose contamination over purity. She chose weakness over strength. She chose me," Zira replied simply. "She chose love over fear, growth over stagnation, hope over the emptiness of genetic supremacy." Her scales cycled through patterns that somehow conveyed both her mother's love and her father's devotion, creating a visual symphony of interspecies affection. Elena felt the moment shifting, teetering on the edge between violence and revelation. Through her neural implant, she sensed the tension spreading across both fleets as crews watched their representatives struggle with truths that challenged everything they'd been taught. Then Zira did something that changed everything. She walked directly to Commander Prexthal, ignoring his raised weapon, and placed her small hand on his armored chest. Her scales erupted in patterns more complex than anything Elena had seen before, configurations that seemed to show not just emotion, but memory itself. The commander gasped and stumbled backward, but Zira followed, her patterns now displaying scenes that could only be his own memories reflected back at him. A younger Lysa Andre, laughing at something he'd said, the moment she'd chosen another, his transformation from wounded lover into fanatical enforcer. "She never forgot your kindness," Zira said softly. "Even at the end, she remembered the person you used to be." The weapon fell from the commander's hands and clattered on the chamber floor. His scales cycled rapidly through confusion, pain, and something that might have been grief before settling on the deep blue of profound sorrow. "What have I become?" he whispered. "Someone who forgot that love creates strength, not weakness," Elena replied, "but it's not too late to remember." Around the chamber, the other purification soldiers were lowering their weapons as they watched their commander's transformation. The ideology that had driven them to this moment was cracking apart in real time, shattered by a child's existence and her impossible gift for showing people their own hearts. Through her neural implant, Admiral Peterson's voice carried urgent updates. "Your Majesty, we're seeing mass surrenders across the purification fleet. Ships are standing down. Crews are requesting permission to come aboard and witness the child for themselves." Elena looked at Zira, whose scales now pulsed with patterns that seemed to encompass hope itself. The child had accomplished what diplomacy, threats, and military force could not. She had changed hearts by simply existing, by being living proof that some things transcended the artificial barriers built by fear. "Commander Prexthal," Elena said gently, "will you tell them what you've seen here?" The scarred warrior looked at Zira with eyes that held wonder instead of hate. "I will tell them that love is not contamination," he said slowly. "I will tell them that this child represents not our destruction, but our evolution." Elder Thrixandal placed a gentle hand on the commander's shoulder. The hardest truths often come from the smallest voices. As if summoned by his words, Zira looked around the chamber, at all the faces, human and Vel'thari, former enemies now united by her impossible existence. Her scales shifted to patterns that somehow conveyed gratitude, hope, and the promise of a future where love transcended the fear of difference. "My mother always said the best things happen when hearts choose to grow instead of close," she said, her voice carrying wisdom far beyond her years. "Today, you all chose to grow." Elena smiled, feeling the weight of potential war lifting from her shoulders. Sometimes, the smallest voices carried the most powerful truths. Sometimes a child's existence could bridge the gap between worlds. Through the chamber windows she could see human and Vel'thari ships moving into cooperative formation, their crews preparing to meet each other not as potential enemies, but as partners in building a future where difference meant strength rather than contamination. Zira had done more than survive the day. She had transformed it into something beautiful. The universe was about to become a much more interesting place.